So today we want to talk about the rise and fall of Soviet communism. If we're talking about the rise of Soviet communism, we have to start out before Soviet communism to understand how we got here, and that is with the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire began in 1721, and it continued until 1917, the Russian Revolution. In its heyday, it was the third largest empire ever in history after the British Empire, which is the largest, and the second largest, does anybody know? Second largest empire in history?
Roman Empire.
No, Mongols. The Mongol Empire, in fact, was the largest contiguous, meaning altogether, empire in the history of the world, and it's the second largest. The third largest was the Russian Empire, and in its heyday, it reached from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Black Sea in the south, from the Baltic Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, pretty much everything in Asia until you get down into Mongolia and India. Again, in its heyday, it not only was the third largest in history, but it had the third largest population of any country in the world after China and India, which are considerably smaller, but just have a whole lot of people packed in there. So a lot of this happened. Today, in this morning's talk, I discussed the Swedish Empire, and we're going to talk about the Swedish Empire later on. There are various other groups of countries that we don't think about as being empires, like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which really was an empire, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We find the Russian Empire coming into its own just as those others are beginning to wane. The Ottoman Empire didn't go away in the 1700s, but it had lost a lot of its territory and had gone into sort of it became known as the sick old man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. And so the Russian Empire really came into its heyday as some of these other empires in Europe were beginning to fade. The beginning house that ruled the Russian Empire was the Romanov house, Peter the Great, and then from 1721 to 1762, and then an offshoot of that called the House of Holstein-Gottorp-Romanov took over, and that carried it all the way until 1917, where Tsar Nicholas II was the last of the line of the Romanov family. In 1917, of course, we have the rise of communist Soviet power under Vladimir Lenin, which leads to Soviet Russia. Previously, to understand how they ended up gaining as much territory as they did, there's really two major factors. One of them is that for hundreds of years, the countries of Eastern Europe and somewhat Central Europe had been a barrier against forces in the East that were always trying to come into Western Europe. The Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and even the Russian Empire. And in doing so, they really weakened themselves. A lot of the countries, like Poland and others that had been significant powers, ended up being considerably weakened as they were the defensive line for so much of Western Europe. So in 1917, the October Revolution was when the Bolsheviks, or the Red Russians, under Vladimir Lenin, defeated the Russian provincial government, or the White Russians, that had replaced Tsar Nicholas when he was arrested and he and his family were killed. And so at that point, a new threat occurred for Europe, and that was the Soviet communism. The Empire of Russia had been a threat previously, but Soviet communism, Soviet Russia at that point, was a kind of threat that Western Europe had not really seen before. Initially, we need to understand that one of the goals of Soviet communism, one of the goals of communism overall, is to take over the whole world. I mean, that sounds obvious, but there really were very specific doctrinal reasons why they felt they were the right political system, and therefore they needed to, if necessary, enforce that political system on the rest of the world. And so there was always, from the time of Lenin on, there was always a real strong intention that they would do everything possible to try to take over Europe. Initially, the Red Army began to move into some of the territories of the former Russian Empire in order to create a communist system there. They created what were called Soviets, which were like workers' parties within each of the countries that had been sort of peripheral countries in the Russian Empire before. And they ended up, through these Soviets, creating what were called Soviet republics. So a Soviet was a workers' party that they would create, sort of like you would think of it as almost as a union, But from that, they created in the various countries of the former Russian Empire, they created communist Soviet political parties that then were able to take over. In 1922, they had enough of these various nations that were controlled by these communist Soviets within them that they created or declared the Soviet Union, which was, as reflected here, was a combination of the Russia, or unification of Russia, the countries of the Transcaucasus, particularly Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, of Ukraine and Byelorussia, what we know today as being Belarus, but it was called Byelorussia at that point. After Lenin's death in 1924, Lenin he was aggressive in his desires, but he sort of limited to the former Soviet Empire, or the former Russian Empire. But he died in 1924, and after a brief struggle, the control of the Soviet Union was taken over by Joseph Stalin. So about 1925, Joseph Stalin comes into power, and Stalin had a completely uncontrolled ambition to take over all of Europe, in fact, the entire world, but obviously he's going to start next door. And so when Stalin really comes into power, this is what we're dealing with. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR as we know it, Russia being the largest part, the various stands, the 5 Central European countries, and then the countries along the border here that had been part of the Russian Empire. So this was the Soviet Union when Stalin came into it, and before we get into the Second World War. In the Second World War, a very strange thing happens, and that is we end up finding 2 very powerful totalitarian regimes who both believe that they have a right to take over the world. And that, of course, is Soviet Russia, or Soviet communism, and the Nazis. Well, one of the things that Stalin believed very strongly is that the only way that he was going to be able to take over Europe is if there was a massive war. Because he believed that if there was a massive war, the countries would be broken down and weakened to the point that they could then come in and take over. Well, he decided that the perfect way to do that was to encourage Adolf Hitler, because Hitler was all geared up to go to war, as we well know. He did exactly that. But in the process of getting there, Hitler and Stalin initially, even though they have fundamentally different kinds of political ambitions, National Socialism versus the Soviet communism, they still were very similar in their desire to take over various countries, and they decided to help each other. In 1939, in a meeting, it was August of 1939, the Nazi foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, visited Moscow. And he met with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav Molotov. And Molotov and Ribbentrop come up with an agreement, which is interestingly called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Tract. These people need to be Smiths and Jones. It would be much easier if you're talking about them. So the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was an agreement by the Nazi Party in Germany and the Soviet communists in the Soviet Union to carve up particularly Eastern and Central Europe. They agreed that they would work together in order to be able to control these various countries. And they signed this agreement, and between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, and the Gestapo worked together. They shared information. In 1939, after signing this agreement, Adolf Hitler invades Poland, just about a month after they signed the agreement. Once he had the assurance from Joseph Stalin that he was not going to interfere with efforts by Hitler to take over Eastern Europe, then they immediately invaded Poland. They take over Poland. The agreement was they were going to split Poland in half, and then the countries would go to Germany, with the exception of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, half of Poland, and then a couple of other little areas that were kind of still being disputed. Well, of course, I don't think anybody would think that Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler were 2 people in history that you might want to trust. And so after signing this agreement and working together from 39 to 41, as the German army is invading more and more of Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe, France, Belgium, etc., Hitler, in June of 1941, launches Operation Barbarossa, which was his plan to take over Soviet Russia and defeat Soviet Russia, which really angered Joseph Stalin, because Joseph Stalin was just about ready to launch his plan Graz, which means thunder in Russian, in order to try to take over Nazi Germany. All right, so he was really mad that Hitler beat him to the punch. But both of them had plans to try to betray the other and to try to come in and take over. And so in June of 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched and the Germans invaded Russia, it opened up the largest and bloodiest theater of war in the history of humanity. I mean, I talked about how horrible the 30 Years' War this morning, but it was nothing compared to the Eastern Front between Soviet Russia and Germany. Of course, eventually, because Germany was fighting battles on two fronts, and because they thought it was going to happen quickly, Napoleon made the same mistake, thought that he would be able to get into Russia and win the victory and get back home, so he didn't really prepare for the winter. Adolf Hitler did the same thing, and so the Germans were not really prepared for the Russian winter either, and when the Russians proved more difficult to defeat than he thought, even though there were massive casualties in Russia, the German army eventually is beaten back. We'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow when we talk about the siege of Leningrad. It's beaten back. The Russians begin to regain all this territory, so that in 1945, they enter Berlin. It was the Soviet army that came into Berlin, mostly because, being allies with the Americans and the British agreed to let Russia get there first because they had suffered so much in the war, not realizing what that would mean, that they would end up controlling eastern part of Germany and 1/4 of Berlin, but a significant part of the city of Berlin. So all of these various countries that they took back, if you will, or that they were able to take over as the Soviet army marched to the west, defeating Germany, they took all these countries, and the assumption of the Western allies was they'll give them back. This is just a process of war, and when it's all over, they will do the same thing that the British and the French and the American allies did, and that is, as soon as possible, go home and give these people back their land. But that was not Joseph Stalin's plan. His plan was to take over the world, and he was going to start with Eastern Europe. And so none of the Western leaders, with the possible exception of Winston Churchill, recognized the danger. Unfortunately, at that point, following the gathering at Malta, Winston Churchill was pretty much pushed aside, and the focus was entirely between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Stalin. And they figured that they were the ones that were really going to be in charge, that the British Empire was going to be on the decline. And so even though Winston Churchill kept saying, you guys better worry about this. I know Patton was famous. He got in really big trouble because a reporter asked him a question once about, well, what do you think about the Russians? And he says, Patton said, being Patton, I think we might as well go ahead and have a war with these guys while we got the army over here to do it, because sooner or later it's going to happen. And he got in huge trouble. He got not actually demoted, but he got transferred because of that. Well, he and Winston Churchill were right. It was in 1946 in a speech that Churchill gave at a small college in Fulton, Missouri. He said that there is a massive curtain of iron, an iron curtain has descended over Europe. And so Churchill was the only one, apparently, is it me? Churchill was the only one who really seemed to get it of all the Western leaders, but nobody was listening to him at that point. And he, of course, after having helped the British win the Second World War, he got voted out of office. Later on, he came back, but he was not seen as very credible then. Turns out he was completely right about that. The other Western leaders were wrong, and Stalin had no intention of giving these countries back. And so these countries, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, the Ukraine, Belarus, part of them had been part of the Soviet Union before, but they ended up taking over more land as part of that. And then the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and then parts of Finland also were pulled into that. And they became known as the Eastern Bloc countries. They were affiliated with the Soviet Union. They were not originally part of the Russian Empire, and so they weren't part of the Central Soviet Union, but they were considered Eastern Bloc. Well, these countries did not, as you might imagine, like the fact that there was an occupying force, that the Red Army had come in, and Stalin immediately began to institute efforts to force these people into a communist form of government. There had been several different forms of government in these countries before, but Stalin decided that the way to force these countries to be in the model of Russian communism, Soviet communism, was to institute what was called the Great Terror. From 1937, starting in 1937, 1938, between 6 and 7 million people, for instance, just from the Ukraine, were starved to death intentionally by Stalin. We always talk about the fact that Adolf Hitler was responsible for the death of 6 million Jews, which is a horrendous thing. There were a lot of people who were not Jewish as well. Jehovah's Witnesses and gypsies and homosexuals and a lot of others were killed at the same time. But Adolf Hitler was a piker compared to the number of people that Joseph Stalin killed. It's estimated his orders were responsible for the death of 25 million people. And many times it was intentional. He starved the people of the Ukraine because in order to be able to move that grain somewhere else, because he valued other people more than he did them. He began to annihilate a whole class of educated people, intelligentsia, not only in Russia, but also in Poland, for instance. He intended to break any opportunity or potential Poland would ever have to regain their independence. Remember, Poland had been a great power in its day. There are great stories about the warriors and armies of Poland defending Western Europe against the onslaught of the Ottoman Muslims. And yet, Stalin was intending to make sure that they never would rise again, and so he massacred a whole generation of educated people there. This campaign of terror was in every one of these countries, the countries of the Soviet Union as well, but especially in the Eastern Bloc countries. There were 4 major waves of deportation just from Poland between 1939 and 1941. 2 million people were forcibly taken from their homes and deported. Many of them were killed along the way, and they have since then, like in 1943, they found a mass burial site in the Katian forest in Poland, where apparently en route, the Russians decided it was just easier to kill these people and bury them all in a big hole than to worry about taking them any further than this. This was all part of the terror. The Soviets arrested and imprisoned 107,000 Poles and executed 65,000 of those people. All of the former officials, military officers, clergy were marked for this. Anyone that they would consider could either was or could potentially be an enemy of the state was either executed or deported. And as I say, they intentionally killed as many intellectuals, as many educated people as they could. In the Baltic countries, they were forcibly Sovietized, was the word that they used, through this terror campaign. The 2,199 Estonians were executed without trial in the first year by the Soviets, and that includes 82 children, 3 of whom were infants, and we have the records of that. Estonia, between 1940 and 1955, lost 30% of its original population. 1/3 of the people were either killed or deported and never able to return. Latvia had 340,000 citizens deported. Lithuania had 740,000 citizens deported. And when the Soviets took these people out of the Baltic countries and the Eastern Bloc countries, they often would take their property from them and give it to Russian-speaking immigrants. And part of the reason for that, this is the same thing the ancient Assyrians used to do. The idea was if we water down the concentration of these people, then they will not have as much of a nationalistic sense and they'll be less likely to rebel. What it meant was that in some of these countries, they ended up with only about 50% after the Soviet occupation, only about 50% of the people were nationals of that country. The rest of them had been imported from somewhere else. And that obviously was very difficult. There was a massive campaign of looting, of rape, and violence by the Red Army on a horrific scale. There were both public and secret trials where defendants were not allowed to offer any evidence in their own defense. You could be arrested for any suggestion that you might not be in support of the Soviet military or the communist regime. When someone was arrested, their families were threatened with torture, so to try to get people to go along with this and not, to confess to whatever they were accused of. When one Yugoslavian communist leader, a communist official who was put there by the Stalinist regime, when he complained about the sexual crimes of the Red Army soldiers against the population, and had specific examples of girls as young as 12 years old being dragged away from their fathers and raped by 10 or 15 soldiers in succession while their fathers were forced to watch. When they complained to Stalin about that, he's reported to have said, and I quote, "Can't they understand if a soldier has crossed thousands of kilometers through blood and fire and death, has fun with a woman, or takes some trifle?" We're talking about the rape of children here, and yet that was their response to it. They set up a whole series in the 1950s, a series of concentration camps. There were 422 of these camps just in Czechoslovakia. And in one region of the 190,000 Germans and foreigners that were put in these special internment camps, over 63,000 of them, 1/3 of them died in these camps. This is a record as bad as what the Nazi concentration camps were guilty of. Just to give us some idea, for a long, long time, until all of this evidence started coming out later, there were still a lot of people who defended Soviet communism as being the way of the future. Well, yeah, they've had some struggles and it's been kind of difficult, but this will be in everybody's best interest. When all of this stuff started coming out and we began to hear the personal accounts from people in the Baltic republics and the Eastern Bloc countries of what they had been through, people stopped suggesting that Soviet communism had been a good idea. Well, Cold War Europe in 1946 was when Winston Churchill said that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. And later on that same year, Winston Churchill called for something like, or and he said, United States of Europe. The idea of getting all of the European nations to work together in defense, particularly, Churchill saw, against the communist threat, but against other threats that might come along. Well, in response to that kind of idea, because people started figuring out the danger that the Soviet communist bloc represented, in 1949, NATO was formed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was created most specifically, not just for this, but most specifically in recognition of the fact that they better be prepared to deal with the Soviet threat if they decide to move further into Europe. In response to that, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact, which was an Eastern Bloc group, was formed, and it was in direct response to the formation 6 years earlier of NATO. And so these are the countries. The blue countries are the NATO states, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway. The yellow states, like Spain, Sweden, and Finland, are non-aligned. They're neither in NATO nor were they in the Warsaw Pact. And the red countries are the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. Yugoslavia, Tito, the head of Yugoslavia, tended to, Stalin always said, I'll snap my fingers and Tito will jump quickly. Well, Tito ended up being a tougher customer than Stalin counted on. And so Yugoslavia ended up gaining, they were still oppressively communist, but they pulled out of the Soviet realm. Albania, in 1962, Albania was thinking that the communist leaders were going in the wrong direction in Russia, so they appealed to communist China for support, for economic support, and as a result, they got thrown out of the Warsaw Pact. Boo-hoo. Most of the people living in the Soviet-controlled countries, especially the Eastern Bloc, constantly believed that their situation was only temporary, that at some point the Western leaders were going to wake up to what was going on, the horrendous things they were suffering, and that they would step forward and there would be a new war, as Patton had suggested, and that the West would free them from this kind of oppression. There were constant rumors of this kind of war from the very first time that the Soviet Union invaded these countries. And because of that, because of this sense that it's only a matter of a short time before the West comes to our defense, there was a constant rebellion within these countries, a military partisan kind of effort. There was always guerrilla warfare. In some of the Baltic countries, this movement became known as the Forest Brothers because all of these soldiers moved into the forests and the swamps in order to carry on partisan guerrilla warfare against the Red Army, believing that any day now, the West is going to come to our rescue. Well, that continued until 1949 and 1950, which means they went on for 4 or 5 years. The communist forces, the Red Army, got more and more intentional about trying to wipe these people out. And in Central and Eastern Europe, in the 49-50, the Soviet Red Army eradicated, either killed or deported virtually all of these partisans. They killed all of their leadership, so that by 1956, there was no more armed resistance to the Soviet powers. They simply had completely suppressed it. And then, if anybody still had an idea that the Soviet Union was really trying to do the right thing, in 1961, Soviet troops, of course, sealed off Berlin. They got tired of all, the visible difference between East Berlin and West Berlin were causing a lot of people to leave East Berlin and go to West Berlin. Well, Moscow recognized the danger of that because all of their skilled workers were leaving. They were going to end up with a peasant village in East Berlin if they didn't do something. And so they built, first with barbed wire and then with stone, concrete, the Berlin Wall to separate it off. And in doing so, because Berlin, of course, is in the middle of Eastern Germany, they ended up having to have an airlift in order to provide supplies to West Berlin. And at that point, recognizing that Moscow, the government of East Germany that was supported by Moscow, was prepared to let Western Berlin, the citizens of West Berlin, starve to death in order to prove their point, and that there had to be an emergency airlift in order to try to provide them with supplies. At that point, most people figured out that there was not a positive side to what the Soviet Union was doing or what they were planning. And this continued. These are just some pictures of the various kinds of violence that occurred and the rebellion. The Berlin Wall, for all of its difficulty, it not only was the point at which people stopped feeling they could defend the Soviet Union or the communist system, but it also was the ultimate example of the failure of Soviet communism. Because the wall was necessitated because anybody who looked at the situation in East Berlin and West Berlin knew that East Berlin was a terrible place to be compared to the West. The fact that they had to seal the borders, not only in Berlin, but also seal the borders between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, that in itself demonstrated the fact that there was a serious problem going on. The quality of life in Eastern Europe was going down and down and down. The Soviet Bloc, the Eastern Bloc countries, were getting worse and worse. Between 1928 and 1948, Russia, just the central power, Russia, went from being a food exporting country to the world's largest food importing country. Their food production went down 25% between 1928 and 1945 or so. They didn't recover back up to the 1928 levels until the late 1950s. The quality of life, how many people were living in what amount of space, the availability of medical care, the number of calories people were eating, the income, how long it took people to make enough money to buy a suit of clothes or to buy a car. In Poland, it took 7 years to get a telephone. And in most of Eastern Europe at that point, when Western Europe, there was a telephone in almost every home by this point in most of the Western European countries, there was only 20% of the people in Eastern Europe that had access to a telephone. So this huge difference in terms of East and West, and it was most exemplified by the fact that nobody wanted to stay in East Berlin or in Eastern Europe if they could get out. That was the greatest example of the failure of the Soviet policy. So now we come to the 1980s. 1989 to 91 really saw the collapse of communism. 1989, the collapse in Eastern Europe, 89-90. 91, the overall collapse. In 1988, It sort of started with Hungary. Hungary had had a couple of attempts to try to break out of the communist role earlier, and they received no support from the West, and so therefore they got squashed. But in 1988, communist Hungary, who has a border with Austria, free Austria, they started making it easier for people to travel to the West. And because people could travel within Eastern Europe as long as they didn't cross over to the West, when Hungary, first they made it easier, and then they completely tore down their barriers between Hungary and Austria. Everybody from the other countries in Eastern Europe started rushing to Hungary to try to get across to the West. That was really one of the first signs that the dam was about to break. A lot of East Germans especially took the opportunity to move over into Hungary, and from Hungary to move into Western Europe. And the Soviet military at that point was simply not in a position to be able to deal with that. Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all the time, you can fool all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, I think what the Soviet Union proved is that you can oppress some of the people all the time, you can oppress all of the people some of the time, but you cannot oppress all the people all the time. Eventually, the numbers are against you. And so in the late 1980s, the dam began to break, and more people were pushing against the barrier, and Hungary was the first place they took down the walls and let people in. In 1989, and you heard about this probably from your tour guides when we were in Gdansk, because that's where it all started. In 1989, Poland was the largest communist country outside Russia itself. And in Gdansk, Poland, at the shipyards, the trade union Solidarity, beginning with an electrician named Lech Walesa, they began to push for freedom. They would not accept some of the rules that were being put against them. And eventually, that year, they ran Solidarity members for Senate. And they won a majority of the seats in the Polish Senate, which was only supposed to be filled, according to the rules, by communists. Well, Poland then became the first satellite state to elect a non-communist prime minister. And then only a year later, they elected Lech Walesa, the electrician who had started this in the Gdansk shipyard, as the first Polish democratically elected president ever, all right, in 1990. In October of '89, Mikhail Gorbachev, the new president of the Soviet Union, visited Berlin, and he was there for the 40th anniversary of Communist Berlin. And while he was there, he saw massive protests occurring in the streets. He said that the communist leaders had to pay attention to the rights and the desires of the people, because he was a smart enough guy to recognize something has to change. That we cannot continue doing it this way. He introduced, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the president of the Soviet Union, he introduced perestroika and glasnost were two of his policies. Perestroika is simply that a willingness to change. Glasnost is to have reform in the government. Glasnost was a policy of saying we're going to be more open, we're going to talk about the problems instead of trying to cover everything up. Well, that was a last-ditch attempt to try to deal with the fact that the Soviet Union could no longer compete with the West. It had failed. They were unable to feed all their people. What was happening is their economic policies had failed in every one of these countries. In the year before Gorbachev resigned, the Soviet Central Command had to provide over $20 billion in financial support to the satellite countries who were doing what they were told to do and were completely failing at it. And so they couldn't afford that anymore. When Ronald Reagan came along, and first he started referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, which, believe it or not, really hurt their feelings because they had the impression that they were a legitimate world power. And Reagan started talking about them as though they were the bully, and that we got to get rid of this bully, we got to get rid of this evil empire. They were really smacked in the face by that, gobsmacked, as my Canadian friends would say. And then when Reagan said that he was going to launch the Star Wars initiative, the Russians knew they could not keep up militarily. They couldn't afford to pay their bills now. In 1986, when the Chernobyl disaster occurred, the nuclear meltdown, which cost them $18 billion just there, and they ended up having to pay $256 million in Belarus to clean up the fallout from it next door. The $18 billion cost to try to immediately address the problems at Chernobyl pretty much bankrupted the Soviet Union. They did not have any money. They could not keep supporting all of these satellite countries who were failing economically because they were following the communist Central Command economic policies, as well as feed their own people. They knew their lifestyle was way behind, and so everything was coming apart. When Gorbachev took over, he instituted perestroika and glasnost as a last-ditch attempt to try to turn the ship around because they knew they were headed for the rocks. But unfortunately, Gorbachev thought that he would be able to make the changes that were necessary to keep the core idea of the Communist Party, but to bring in enough openness, enough reform to be able to make it work. He was not successful. In November of 1989, East German television announced that people could now travel to the West, and within a few hours, the wall had been pulled down in Berlin. Tractors, trailers, earth-moving equipment went out there, and people celebrated the brink coming down of the wall. That same year, 1989, in Czechoslovakia, there was unrest and rioting, and the entire communist government resigned. 200,000 people celebrated the end of communist rule in Czechoslovakia, and they immediately elected the dissident playwright and leader Václav Havel as president. In December of 1989, protests erupted in Romania, and Ceausescu and his wife, who were horrendous dictators, I mean, they warehoused people, children with disabilities, so that nobody would have to look at them, and it was just horrendous. He ordered the army to put down the rebellion. At first they started, but the demonstrators wouldn't give up, and so the army turned around and decided to support the demonstrators. Ceausescu and his wife tried to run for it. They were caught, arrested, tried, and executed. Publicly executed. Well, they were publicly executed, but they filmed it and then distributed the evidence that they had been executed. Bulgaria had anti-communist protests, and as a result, the communist leader Zhivkov stepped down after 34 years in power. This is all happening within a few months. No one expected the Soviet Union to fall the way it did. It was a complete surprise to the American intelligence community. You know, the president turned to the CIA and said, "Did you not see at least some of this coming?" And they went, "Completely missed it. No idea this was going to happen." But every month, one or two of these Soviet-backed regimes were falling. And on October 3rd of 1990, just a year after East Berlin and Eastern Germany opened up, East and West Germany were rejoined as one nation. And then on December 25th, Christmas Day of 1991, President Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the 8th and final leader of the Soviet Union, resigned. He declared that his office was extinct. He handed the powers, including the nuclear codes, over to the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, and the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. The next day, December 26th of 1991, the Supreme Soviet issued Declaration number 142H, in which they officially dissolved the Soviet Union. They acknowledged the independence of all the former Soviet republics, and they declared the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS. And so we were left with this, 15 countries resulting from the fall of the USSR. Russia obviously being one, and the Russian Federation, including some of the other areas, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Oddly enough, the stands, the 5 Central Asian countries, had not planned on being independent. They weren't fighting for independence. And all of a sudden, they find themselves having to govern themselves. And I'm going to be going there next month, so it's going to be interesting to talk to some people there, to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, the Transcaucasus countries, the Ukraine, Moldova, and then the Balkans, the Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Belarus. All of them are independent republics, almost overnight. So why did this happen? How did all of this fall apart? Well, as I said, communism had been a complete failure. It simply did not work. It didn't work economically. It didn't work in terms of meeting people's needs. Nobody wanted to support it. Ronald Reagan needs to be given a lot of credit. He was the one that really believed the Soviet Union could be tipped over. Almost nobody else believed that, but Reagan was convinced. And so he made a concerted effort through the Star Wars initiative that never really happened, but the fact that it was a threat, that economically Russia knew Soviet Union knew they couldn't keep up with it, his evil empire comments and everything else. He would go into meetings with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev would start saying things that Reagan thought was outrageous, and Reagan would get up and leave. We're not even going to talk about that. Don't expect that we're going to give you credit for anything. So financially, it was necessary that the Soviet Union changed, and they were unable to change sufficiently. And so the victory of the Western system over communism was because the communist system, the USSR, got pushed into a corner. It was not only the economic problems they had, but also the constant, persistent, no matter how much terror they tried to apply, no matter what they tried to do, the opposition they continued to receive from Eastern Bloc countries, the area they tried to control, all of that together meant they simply couldn't sustain it anymore. Now, unfortunately, when they left the countries of Eastern Europe, they left them in a horrendous mess. So much so that some people ended up within a year or so saying, was life not better under communism than this? Here you have a woman wearing a uniform of the Soviet army, and her poster says, "Back to the future, back to the USSR." Well, the reason was that none of these countries, not even Russia, was in a position to do any better by themselves. In fact, they had been left in a worse position. And when they no longer had the option of asking for help from the Central Command economic government in Moscow, they really suffered for it. Development was very uneven. They didn't have people who were really in a position to provide the leadership they wanted. Some of the countries tried to sort of ease away from communism, and that was a real mess. The ones that did best, the countries like the Baltic republics, that sort of drew a line and said, we are not going to do that anymore. We're going to do the hard thing of completely changing into what we need to be. They were the ones that did best, but still, it was a struggle. The industry and the systems that were put in place by the Soviet government were using more than twice as many natural resources as the same sort of efforts were in the West. They did not have the technology to be able to move forward. And as I say, they didn't have the leadership. Another thing that is quite horrendous is the way that the Soviets left Eastern Europe and Russia, all of the former Soviet Union, in terms of the ecological catastrophes. Every one of the countries that had been part of the Soviet Union or Soviet bloc suffered from extraordinarily high levels of pollution. The Aral Sea was just dismissed. It was used as a waste dumping center, and the Aral Sea, one of the largest lakes in the world, was completely dead because of the Soviets' approach. The levels of sulfur dioxide in Tallinn, Estonia, where we're going to be, was 5 to 6 times higher than it was in Helsinki, the other place we're going to be, because of the Soviets' approach, not caring about the environment, particularly not caring about the environment in countries that they control. 80% of the lakes that were investigated in Finland following this were in great shape compared to only 20% of the lakes in Estonia. When I say only 20% of the lakes, that means only 20% of the lakes in Estonia could sustain life at that point. One report from a politician in the Netherlands who did a survey in Central and Eastern Europe in 1991 said housing and sewer systems are simply collapsing. Without the proper infrastructure, the transition countries have no hope of obtaining the investments they so desperately need. A lot of money was also needed to repair the environmental damage caused by communism. In Czechoslovakia, the coal mining and industrial regions were covered with acid rain. Their strip mining had destroyed all of the bodies of water. 70% of the rivers in Czechoslovakia were considered severely polluted. 60% of the forests in Czechoslovakia were defoliated and dying. 50% of all drinking water was contaminated. East Germany had spewed out more sulfur emissions than any other country in Europe, and they dumped more than 100 tons of waste, including heavy metals and dioxins, into the River Elbe every day. 100 tons of heavy metals and pollutants into the River Elbe. In Poland, 95% of the country's river water was unfit for consumption. 30% of their forest had been damaged. groundwater reserves were contaminated. In Romania, 80% of the water, of the surface water, rivers and lakes was polluted. This is the legacy that the Soviet Union had left to these countries that they controlled. Slowly, those countries have been digging out from under that. And as you'll see when we get to Tallinn, when we, we were in Gdansk, it's extraordinary what they have been able to do between the early 90s and now. Now, they've really struggled. Some of them have gone through several different governments because of the struggle to try to gain some stability, to develop economic capabilities to move forward. But they are viable now. And in the post-USSR world, Russia is still a huge country, but it is one country. The Central Asian republics exist. The various countries of the Balkans are all independent. Eastern European bloc countries are all independent. They are self-sustaining and self-governing now, despite all that they've gone through. And again, more than anything else, it demonstrated that communism, as it was designed by Soviet communism, simply did not work. In no way did it work. It could not sustain itself. Questions about any of that? Another happy talk. Yes?
Could you elaborate on why you think it was such a failure, not economically perhaps, but what was it about the communist system that really caused it?
Really didn't work.
Yeah, it really didn't work.
What about the system really didn't work? Well, first off, the fact that it was something they had to try to force on people. People may be convinced to change, but to be forced to change, you're immediately going to rebel against that. I mean, human history has shown that. But probably the biggest single factor was that the Soviet system did not account for the need for human initiative. If I can be lazy and not do any work, and I'm going to get just as much as the guy next door that is really working hard and really doing a good job and really growing great crops or producing good materials or working extra hours, and I get the same as he does, why should I work hard? Why should I care about the quality of product if I don't get rewarded for that? It is innate in human nature that if I work harder, I should be rewarded more. Well, the Soviet system didn't allow for that. Everybody was equal. Everybody was guaranteed a job. If you travel to Soviet Russia during those days, every floor of the hotel there would be a key lady. They had all these people doing all these different little tasks because everybody had to be given a job. The jobs frequently were not meaningful. If they did the job well and really tried hard, they didn't get anything more than if they just sloughed off and did it halfway. So what's the motivation to make that work? There is none. It is directly contrary to human nature, as much as anything else. So forcing people to be what you want them to be and not rewarding initiative, always going to fail. Over here.
So we took a tour with a private guide, a couple actually, in Lithuania, and he talked about the population dropping.
Right.
That the young people have left. They're down to 2.8 million from 3.5 million. And we have more people than that in Orange County, California.
Right.
And growing. So, and I remember talking to a lady in Dubrovnik a few years ago. There's no elementary school left in Dubrovnik. There's no children.
Mm-hmm.
So what is actually going to happen demographically with these small states? I don't understand what the success path is.
Yeah, what's going to happen given the fact that population growth is falling? Well, that's a problem in the former Soviet Union, but it's a problem around the world. Most developing countries, if they're paying attention, it used to be we were talking about zero population growth. We're having too many babies. Unfortunately, most developed countries in the world today, projections are that within the next 20 or 30 years, we're not going to have enough young people to be able to sustain the workforce even. We're going to have all of us old fogies who are retired and expecting somebody to help support us through retirement or whatever, and not enough people to work. So that's a global problem almost. It's the underdeveloped nations that have more children. It's a strange thing that under stress, the human bodies become more fertile. And it's also true that in poorer countries where they have a high infant mortality rate, families have more children in order to try to have somebody to be around to help them. So In terms of the Soviet countries, a lot of young people did leave because even though they're doing well now, they're doing better, they still aren't up to the same level as Western Europe or North America. And so there's always that attraction, there's always that draw. But I think they're getting better. You know, they're improving faster than we are, and I think that they eventually will catch up. I think that will balance itself out. The problem is going to be more a global problem of not having enough young people overall. But that's beyond my pay grade, to be honest. I'm not, you know, I'm no population expert or anything like that. So, yes?
What is your impression of where Russia is headed from here?
Where Russia's headed for here? Well, anytime you talk about where Russia's headed for here, you have to talk one word: Putin. It's very discouraging. I think they were, for all of their struggles, they were doing well. I mean, some of the things that they did in Russia to try to get their feet under them after Soviet communism, they took all of these publicly owned industries. You know, the government owned everything. Well, they took them and they created stock for these companies, and they distributed the stock to common people and said, you're now an owner of this company, a part owner. Well, these people, many of them were not well educated. They didn't really understand the value of that. They didn't understand economics. They had lived for 70 years where you never thought about that. You know, those things didn't exist. And what happened was some of what are now the oligarchs in Russia went around and for peanuts, you know, okay, I'll give you a bottle of really good vodka in return for those 5 shares you have for this, and those shares didn't mean anything. Then great, that's good vodka, I'll take that. And you end up with these Russian billionaires because they were, you know, they were clever, they were sneaky. They went around and they gathered up all of these resources that it's supposedly going to be distributed to the people. So you end up with an even greater gap between the richest and the poorest in many ways. And the human ambition thing, you know, in the worst days of Soviet Union, there were still men, especially, who had chauffeur-driven cars, and they had dachas, you know, these summer homes that they could go to, and they had really nice apartments, and they had special stores that only they could shop at, where they could get all the goods you wanted. You know, whereas the shelves of many of the Russian stores looked like that. You know, that's what the people dealt with, but they had very well-stocked luxury stores for the people who were part of the party and the leaders. So that was happening even in the worst days of the Soviet Union, and it's happening now. You know, there are people that are using their political positions and their influence to gain power, authority, wealth, whatever for themselves. That's always going to be true. What's going to happen specifically with Putin and with Russia? Again, that's above my pay grade. I don't really know. If I did, they'd be paying me a lot of money to be in Washington, D.C. telling them what they ought to do next, right? Other questions? Thank you all very much for being here, and we will see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.